They called it the Bay of Biscay, but by 1943, the Allied airmen knew it by another name, the killing field. And in those dark waters, something impossible was happening. American bombers, machines built to rain destruction on cities and factories, were hunting submarines. But these weren't ordinary B-25 Mitchells. These were monsters, their noses bristling with 850 caliber machine guns, and they were about to teach the Kriegsmarine a lesson in terror it would never forget. How did a medium bomber become the U-boat's worst nightmare? And why did Germany, master of undersea warfare, never see it coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. March 1943. The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard wearing the mask of water. Beneath its surface, wolf packs prowled, silent and merciless. Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boats moved like specters through the deep, rising only to strike, vanishing before vengeance could find them. They were the reapers of the convoy routes, the unseen hand that dragged merchant ships and their crews into the abyss. Every week, another 100,000 tons of Allied shipping settled under the ocean floor. Fuel, food, ammunition, the lifeblood of Britain's survival, all of it bleeding out into salt water and darkness. The numbers told a story of slow strangulation. In the first 3 months of 1943 alone, over 90 merchant vessels had been sent to the bottom. The mathematics were brutal and simple. If the killing continued at this pace, Britain would starve before America could save her. The invasion of Europe, the dreams of liberation, all of it would drown in the same waters that swallowed those cargo ships. The U-boat was not just a weapon, it was a noose, tightening with each torpedo that found its mark. For the men who sailed the convoys, every voyage was a lottery with death. They steamed across the Atlantic knowing that beneath them, perhaps 100 feet down, perhaps 1,000, steel tubes filled with compressed malice waited for the perfect angle. The explosion, when it came, offered no warning. One moment, a ship plowed through gray swells under gray skies. The next, a column of water and fire announced another victory for the Kriegsmarine. The survivors, if there were survivors, had minutes in the frigid water before hypothermia claimed what the torpedoes had missed. But the convoys were not defenseless. Destroyers and corvettes circled the merchant ships like sheepdogs around a flock, their sonar pinging endlessly into the depths, listening for the echo that meant death was near. When they found a U-boat, they attacked with depth charges, barrels of explosive that tumbled into the water and detonated at preset depths, crushing steel hulls with walls of pressure. Yet the ocean was vast, and the submarines were few and cunning. For every U-boat killed, 2 more slipped through to hunt again. The air offered little help. Patrol aircraft, lumbering flying boats and converted bombers, searched the surface for the telltale wake of a periscope or the shadow of a submarine running shallow. But their range was limited, their weapons inadequate. A U-boat captain who spotted an aircraft had time to dive, time to vanish, time to survive. The gap in coverage, the black pit in the middle of the Atlantic where no land-based aircraft could reach, became known as the air gap. In that void, the submarines ruled absolutely. And then, there was the Bay of Biscay. This body of water, stretching from the western coast of France to the northern shores of Spain, was the highway for U-boats traveling between their bunkers in occupied France and their hunting grounds in the Atlantic. Every submarine that wanted to kill had to cross it. Every U-boat returning to port, low on fuel and torpedoes, had to cross it again. The bay was a choke point, a corridor where the hunters had to expose themselves, if only briefly, to the sky. The Allies understood this. If they could not protect every convoy, if they could not search every mile of the Atlantic Ocean, they could at least make the Bay of Biscay a place of terror. They could turn the highway into a gauntlet. British Coastal Command had been trying for months, sending out Sunderlands and Wellingtons to patrol the gray waters, hunting for the moment when a U-boat surfaced to run its diesel engines and recharge its batteries. Some successes had been won, some submarines damaged or sunk, but not enough.
never enough. The U-boat captains adapted. They traveled in groups now, surfacing together so their combined anti-aircraft fire could drive off attackers. They mounted more guns on their decks, turning their vessels into floating fortresses that could fight back against the aircraft. They learned the patrol patterns, the gaps in coverage, the times when the sky was empty. The bay remained dangerous, but crossable. The submarines continued to flow outward to the killing grounds and return home to rearm. What the Kriegsmarine needed was a weapon that could break this stalemate, something that could shatter the attacking aircraft before they could press home their runs. What they had were deck guns, 20mm cannons, and the occasional heavier piece. Formidable against a single attacker, perhaps, but not enough to guarantee survival. German engineers worked frantically on better anti-aircraft mounts, faster-firing weapons, anything to tip the scales back in favor of the submarines. But solutions took time, and time was the one resource growing scarce. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American and British commanders stared at maps and charts, calculating losses, measuring the bleeding, searching for an answer. The U-boat had to be stopped. Not in the mid-Atlantic, where it was strongest, but at its source, in the waters it had to cross to reach the hunting grounds. The Bay of Biscay had to become impassable. But how? The patrol aircraft were doing their best, but their best was not enough. In England, at a windswept airfield in Cornwall, a different kind of thinking was taking root. The officers of the United States Army Air Forces, men who had spent their careers thinking about bombing cities and destroying factories, were starting to ask a strange question. What if a bomber could hunt submarines? Not by dropping bombs from high altitude, a futile gesture against a target that could dive in seconds, but by attacking at wave-top height, by turning the bomber itself into a gun platform that could shred a U-boat before it had time to submerge. The idea was not entirely new. Aircraft had been strafing submarines for months, using their machine guns to rake the decks and kill the crew, to damage the diving planes and slow the submarine's descent. But the standard nose armament of a bomber, a single machine gun or two, was insufficient. What was needed was overwhelming firepower, a storm of bullets so dense and destructive that a U-boat caught on the surface would be torn apart before it could fight back or escape. The B-25 Mitchell, North American Aviation's twin-engine medium bomber, seemed an unlikely candidate for this role. It had been designed to carry bombs, to strike at targets inland, to support ground forces and destroy infrastructure. Its crews trained for level bombing runs, for formation flying, for the steady, methodical work of hitting targets that did not shoot back with much enthusiasm. The Mitchell was reliable, sturdy, and unremarkable. It was not a fighter. It was not a gunship. It was a workhorse, and workhorses did not hunt submarines. But someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had a vision. The B-25 had a nose. The nose was large. The nose could be modified. What if, instead of a bombardier station with a single gun, the entire nose was packed with machine guns? What if 8 50-caliber Brownings, the same weapons that made American fighters so deadly, were mounted in the nose of a Mitchell, all firing forward, all converging on a single point? The math was staggering. A single 50-caliber machine gun fired at a rate of roughly 800 rounds per minute. 8 guns, firing together, would pour out over 6,000 rounds per minute. Each bullet was a half.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Inch of copper-jacketed lead, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through steel plate, to shatter machinery, to reduce a human body to ruin. 8 such guns, focused on a submarine's hull, could saw through the pressure casing, could rupture fuel tanks, could turn a U-boat into a sinking wreck in seconds. The idea moved from theory to practice with the speed of desperation. Modified B-25s began appearing, their noses rebuilt, their bombardier stations removed, replaced with clusters of machine guns protruding like the fangs of some mechanical predator. Additional guns were mounted in the sides of the nose, angled slightly to widen the cone of fire. The result was ungainly, brutish, a machine that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed elegance was a luxury the war could not afford. But appearance meant nothing. Performance meant everything. The modified Mitchells, soon dubbed Strafer variants, began arriving in England in early 1943, assigned to units tasked with patrolling the Bay of Biscay. The crews, bomber pilots and gunners accustomed to high-altitude work, had to be retrained. Low-level attack was a different art, a different nightmare. There was no time for evasion, no altitude to trade for speed. The approach had to be fast, low, and perfectly timed. Miss the target, and the submarine would dive. Approach too slowly, and the U-boat's gunners would have time to aim, time to fire, time to kill. The crews learned. They practiced on targets in the water, on wrecks and floating debris, learning to judge distance and angle, learning to hold their fire until the range was so close that missing was impossible. They learned to fly at 50 feet, at 30, skimming the wave tops with their propellers nearly kissing the spray. They learned to live with the knowledge that a single mistake, a moment of inattention, would send them cartwheeling into the ocean at 200 miles per hour. And then they went hunting. The first encounters were tentative, experimental. A B-25 Strafer would spot a U-boat on the surface, engines running, crew on deck enjoying the brief freedom of open air. The Mitchell would drop to wave height and accelerate, closing the distance before the submarine could react. At 1,000 yards, the U-boat's lookouts would see the aircraft and sound the alarm. At 500 yards, the deck guns would open fire, tracers arcing up toward the bomber. At 300 yards, the Mitchell's guns would answer. The effect was apocalyptic. 8 streams of 50 caliber fire converged on the submarine's hull, the bullets striking with the sound of a giant drum roll, a continuous thunder that drowned out the roar of engines and the shouts of men. The first bursts tore into the conning tower, shredding the lookouts, killing the officers, turning the command center into an abattoir. The next bursts walked down the deck, punching through the thin plating, finding the pressure hull beneath, drilling holes that would flood the interior spaces and drag the submarine down even if it managed to dive. The U-boat crews fought back with everything they had. 20mm cannons barked defiance, tracers lancing toward the oncoming bomber. Occasionally, they scored hits. A B-25 would stagger, trailing smoke, an engine dying or a fuel tank ruptured. Some Mitchells went down, plunging into the bay in flames, their crews lost. But more often, the submarine died first. The sheer volume of fire from the Strafer was too much, too fast. By the time the U-boat's pounds had zeroed in, the Mitchell was overhead and past, climbing away, leaving behind a wreck settling into the water, oil spreading across the surface, debris and bodies marking the grave. The news of these attacks spread through the U-boat fleet like a virus. Captains who had once considered the bay a routine transit now approached it with dread. The sky, which had been an annoyance, became a source of terror. The sound of aircraft engines, once merely a signal to dive, now carried the promise of death, too fast to escape.
Hunt, by the knowledge that every convoy they attacked might be their last, began to crack under the weight of this new threat. Donitz, reading the reports from his captains, from the survivors of attacks, understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. The bay was no longer crossable with acceptable losses. The modified American bombers, these 8-gun nightmares, were killing submarines at a rate that could not be sustained. If the trend continued, the U-boat offensive would collapse not from lack of submarines, but from the inability to get them to the hunting grounds. He issued new orders. U-boats were to cross the bay in larger groups, maximizing their defensive firepower. They were to travel submerged during daylight whenever possible, even though it meant slower speeds and drained batteries. They were to avoid areas where the strafers had been reported. But these were defensive measures, the tactics of a force that was losing control. The initiative had shifted. The hunters were becoming the hunted. In the airfields of Cornwall and Devon, the B-25 Strafer crews felt it. They were no longer just another patrol unit. They were the tip of the spear, the weapon that was turning the tide. Every mission brief was a chance to find another U-boat.
Every takeoff was a step toward ending the slaughter in the Atlantic. The work was brutal, the losses real, but the results were undeniable. The submarines were dying, and the convoys were getting through. But the Germans were not defeated. They were adapting. In the U-boat pens, in the shipyards, in the design bureaus, frantic work was underway to find a counter to the strafers. Heavier anti-aircraft guns were mounted on the submarines, quadruple 20mm mounts that could put up a wall of fire dense enough to force the Mitchells to break off their attacks. New tactics were developed, ways to coordinate the defensive fire of multiple U-boats to create overlapping fields of fire that no bomber could penetrate. And in the skies over the bay, the battle intensified. The strafers came in lower, faster, accepting higher risks to press home their attacks. The U-boats fought back harder, their gunners standing exposed on the decks, firing until the Mitchells' bullets cut them down or the submarine sank beneath them. It was a duel without mercy, a collision of technologies and wills, played out over gray water under gray skies. For the men in the B-25s, the missions became a test of nerve. Every approach was a calculation of angles and speeds, and the certainty that someone was about to die. The pilot's job was to hold the aircraft steady, to give the guns a stable platform, to ignore the tracers coming up, to trust that speed and surprise would carry them through. The co-pilot watched the instruments, called out altitude, prepared to take over if the pilot was hit. The gunners in the waist and tail positions scanned for fighters, for additional U-boats, for threats the pilots could not see. And in the nose, behind the battery of 50 calibers, the nose gunner became the executioner. His was the trigger that unleashed the storm. His was the aim that decided whether the bullets would shred the conning tower or splash harmlessly into the water. The best nose gunners developed an instinct, a feel for the range and the lead, for the moment when the firing solution was perfect. They learned to ignore the return fire, to block out the knowledge that one lucky shell could end them, to focus entirely on the target and the trigger. The missions followed a pattern. Take off at dawn, when the light was gray and the bay was a sheet of hammered pewter. Climb to patrol altitude, 1,000 feet, high enough to see the surface, low enough to dive quickly if a target appeared. Then the endless circling, the eyes straining to spot the dark shape of a submarine against the dark water, the thin line of a wake, the feather of spray from a periscope. Sometimes the patrols found nothing. The bay was vast, and the submarines were small. Hours would pass in monotony, broken only by the drone of the engines,
and the occasional sighting of a merchant ship or a friendly patrol boat. Then the fuel would run low, and the Mitchell would turn for home, landing at dusk with nothing to report. But other times, the hunt was successful. A lookout would spot a shadow, a disturbance in the water. The pilot would bank toward it, descending, confirming the sighting. Yes, a submarine. On the surface, running fast toward the Atlantic. The order would go out over the intercom, diving to attack. The Mitchell would drop like a stone, engines roaring, speed building, the water rushing up to meet them. The U-boat would see them coming, claxons would sound, men would scramble to their guns or dive for the hatch. The deck guns would swing toward the attacker, muzzles flashing. The Mitchell would level out at 50 feet, the pilot's world narrowing to the submarine ahead, the nose gunner's fingers closing on the triggers. And then the guns would fire, and the ocean would erupt in spray and smoke and the echoes of destruction. After the attack, the Mitchell would climb away, circling to assess the damage. Sometimes the submarine was clearly finished, settling bow first into the water, its crew abandoning ship, oil spreading in a dark stain. Other times, the U-boat would limp away, trailing smoke, diving slowly, damaged but not dead. The Mitchell would report the position, call for surface ships to finish the job, and continue the patrol or return to base, depending on fuel and damage. Back at the airfield, the debriefs were clinical. What type of U-boat, what time, what position, how many guns fired, what damage observed. The intelligence officers recorded it all, building a picture of the battle from fragments and observations. The crews, exhausted, would eat, sleep, and prepare to do it again the next day. The losses among the strafer crews were significant.
Not every mission ended with a safe return. Some Mitchells took too much damage and crashed into the bay. Others were caught by German fighters, Focke-Wulf FW-190s or Junkers Ju-88s, and shot down before they could reach safety. The anti-aircraft fire from the U-boats was deadly, and luck, which favored the bold, sometimes ran out. But the losses among the U-boats were worse. By the summer of 1943, the Bay of Biscay had become a death trap. Submarines that once crossed with confidence now made the transit with fear. The 8-gun strafers were everywhere, or seemed to be. The captains could never know when a Mitchell would appear dropping out of the sun or rising from behind a wave, guns blazing. The psychological impact was immense. The U-boat, which had been the terror of the Atlantic, was now the prey. Donitz tried everything. He ordered his submarines to cross only at night, but the Allied patrols adapted, using radar and searchlights to find targets in the darkness. He ordered them to stay submerged, but the slow underwater speeds meant longer transits, more time exposed to air attack, and exhausted batteries that left the submarines vulnerable. He concentrated them into groups, but the strafers learned to attack the groups anyway, accepting the heavier fire in exchange for multiple kills. The strategic situation was shifting. The U-boats were still dangerous, still sinking ships, but their effectiveness was declining. The convoys were getting stronger, the escorts more numerous and better equipped. The air gap was shrinking as longer-range patrol aircraft, including American-built B-24 Liberators, extended their reach. And now the bay, the vital artery that fed the U-boat campaign, was being strangled. For Germany, the implications were dire. The submarine arm had been the Kriegsmarine's most potent weapon, the tool that might starve Britain into surrender and prevent an Allied invasion of Europe. If the U-boats could not operate, if they could not reach their targets, then the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. And if the Atlantic was lost, then the war was lost. But in the spring and summer of 1943, that endgame was not yet clear. The U-boats still sailed, the convoys still burned, the battle continued, and in the Bay of Biscay, the B-25 strafers pressed their advantage.
Every mission was a chance to kill another submarine. Every submarine killed was another convoy saved, another 1,000 tons of supplies delivered, another step toward victory. The crews of the Mitchells did not think in grand strategic terms. They thought in simpler ones. Find the submarine, attack, survive, go home, do it again. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and deadly, but it was also effective. And in a war where effectiveness was measured in lives saved and enemies killed, the strafers were proving their worth beyond any doubt. The U-boat crews, for their part, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing. They manned their guns under fire, stayed at their posts even as the Mitchells' bullets tore through the steel around them, and died believing that their sacrifice mattered. Some U-boats made it through the bay, some reached the Atlantic and sank Allied ships, but fewer and fewer returned. The Bay of Biscay, once a highway, had become a grinder, and the B-25 strafers were the teeth. The transformation of the Bay of Biscay from transit corridor to killing ground did not happen overnight, nor did it happen without cost. By June 1943, the strafer squadrons had established a rhythm, a deadly pattern of patrols that caught U-boats at their most vulnerable moments. The submarines could no longer predict when the sky would remain empty. Every surface run became a gamble, every breath of fresh air for the crew a potential invitation to oblivion. The German Naval Command watched the casualty reports with mounting alarm, each lost boat representing not just steel and machinery, but 45 trained men swallowed by the sea. Lieutenant Commander Werner Hartmann stood on the bridge of U-517, scanning the horizon with binoculars that felt heavier with each passing hour. His submarine had left Lorient 3 days earlier, bound for the North Atlantic convoy routes, but those 3 days had aged him years. The crossing of the bay, which he had made a dozen times before, now felt like threading a needle while blindfolded. His crew, veterans of 2 years of combat, moved with the jittery efficiency of men who knew they were being hunted. The weather offered no comfort. The sky was clear, visibility unlimited,
perfect conditions for aircraft. Hardman had timed their surface run for dawn, gambling that the Allied patrols would not yet be airborne, that the gap between night operations and day operations would give him a window. His diesel engines hammered at full power, driving U-517 westward at 17 knots, every revolution of the screws carrying them closer to the deep water where they could submerge and disappear. But the Atlantic was still hours away, and his batteries were nearly depleted from the overnight submerged transit. He had no choice but to run on the surface, exposed, vulnerable. The lookouts, 4 men stationed around the bridge with sectors to watch, swept their binoculars endlessly across the sky and sea. They had been briefed on the American strafers, on the Mitchells with their nose-mounted batteries of machine guns. They knew the profile, the sound, the tactics. They knew that if they spotted one, their lives would be measured in seconds. The protocol was simple. Sight the aircraft, sound the alarm, man the guns or dive depending on range and bearing. But protocols were clean on paper and messy in reality, and reality favored the attacker.
Crew scrambling below, unable to man the guns or fight back. Their only chance was to stay up and fight, to put up enough fire to force the bomber to break off or at least make its approach costly. He barked orders. Gun crews to stations, all weapons ready. Hold fire until I gave the command. The men moved, fear turning their limbs to lead, training pulling them through the motions. U-517 carried 2 twin 20mm anti-aircraft mounts, one forward of the conning tower, one aft. Each mount required 2 men, a gunner and a loader. The gunners scrambled up from below, hauling ammunition belts, locking the guns into position, scanning for the target. Hardman stayed on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his face, watching the Mitchell grow larger. He could see it clearly now, nose packed with gun barrels, wings level, coming straight at them. The pilot was good, holding low, using the curve of the earth and the glare of the rising sun to mask his approach. But they had seen him in time. They would get their shots. At 2 kilometers, Hartman gave the order. Fire! The twin mounts opened up, their hammering roar drowning out the diesel engines. Tracers arced toward the Mitchell, bright orange lines scratching across the sky. The gunners walked their fire toward the target, adjusting for range and deflection, pouring shells into the air. Some of the rounds fell short, splashing into the water. Others went high, disappearing into the sky. But some, a handful, found their mark. Hartman saw flashes on the Mitchell's fuselage, saw pieces of metal tear away. The bomber staggered, dipped one wing, then leveled out and kept coming. At 1 kilometer, the Mitchell's guns answered. Hartman saw the muzzle flashes, 8 points of light winking in the nose, and then the world turned into noise and chaos. The first burst walked across the water in front of U-517, geysers of spray erupting as the bullet struck. The second burst found the submarine. The 50 caliber rounds hammered into the deck plating, punching through, ricocheting off harder surfaces, tearing into equipment and flesh. The forward gun mount disintegrated, the gunner and loader cut down in an instant, their bodies collapsing onto the deck. The conning tower rang like a bell as bullets struck it, some penetrating, some glancing off, all of them loud as artillery shells. Hartman dropped flat, instinct overriding thought. He felt the round snapping overhead, heard the screams of men hit, smelled blood and cordite and hot metal. The aft gun mount was still firing, the gunner standing his ground, swinging the barrels to track the Mitchell as it roared overhead. Then the bomber was past, the thunder of its engines fading, the storm of bullets ending as suddenly as it had begun. Hartman rolled to his knees, looked aft, saw the aft gun mount torn apart, the crew dead or dying. He looked forward, saw the forward mount shredded, saw bodies. He looked at the conning tower, saw holes, saw smoke leaking from below. The Mitchell was climbing, banking, coming around for another pass. Hartman had seconds to decide. His guns were gone, his deck was a slaughterhouse, his boat was holed in multiple places, water pouring in through the damaged plating. Diving was the only option now, the only chance. He screamed the order, "Emergency dive! All hands below!" The survivors scrambled for the hatch, dragging wounded with them, abandoning the dead. Hartman was the last down, slamming the hatch shut, dogging it tight. The vents opened, the ballast tanks flooded, and U-517 slid beneath the surface just as the Mitchell lined up for its second attack. The bomber's guns chewed the water where the submarine had been, but U-517 was already gone, sinking into the gray-green depths, bleeding oil and air, trailing debris. Inside the pressure hull, damage control teams worked frantically to shore up leaks, to stop the flooding, to keep the boat from sinking the crush depth. Hartman, standing in the control room, bleeding from a scalp wound he did not remember receiving, listened to the reports. 6 men dead, 8 wounded, hull integrity compromised but holding.
Main ballast tanks functional, batteries intact. They would live, at least for now. But the mission was over. U-517 would not reach the convoy routes. It would limp back to Lorient, if it could make the journey. Another casualty of the strafers. Above, the Mitchells circled the oil slick, the pilot noting the position, radiating the contact report. Another U-boat damaged, possibly sunk. The crew would claim a probable kill. The intelligence officers would mark it on the map. And the next day, another patrol would fly, hunting for the next target. Stories like Hartman's multiplied throughout the summer. U-boats attacked, damaged, sunk. Crews killed, wounded, traumatized. The submarines that survived brought back tales of the 8-gun monsters, of attacks so fast and violent that there was no time to react, no time to fight back effectively. The morale of the U-boat arm, once sky-high, began to crack. Men who had volunteered for submarine duty, who had been proud to serve in the elite force, now dreaded the crossing of the bay. Some cracked under the strain, were removed from duty, replaced by younger men who had not yet learned to fear. Dönitz, facing reality, made a brutal calculation. The losses in the bay were unsustainable, but abandoning the Atlantic was unthinkable. The U-boats had to continue operating, which meant they had to cross the bay, which meant accepting the casualties. He could not stop the strafers, could not shoot down every Mitchell, could not protect every submarine. All he could do was make the crossing as quick and as defended as possible, and hope that enough boats made it through to justify the losses. New tactics were tried. U-boats began crossing in heavily armed groups, sometimes 4 or 5 submarines together, their combined anti-aircraft firepower creating a zone of fire dense enough to give the Mitchells pause. This worked to a degree. The strafers, faced with multiple U-boats shooting back, sometimes broke off their attacks or attacked less aggressively, settling for distant strafing runs instead of close-in gun passes. But grouped submarines were easier to spot, and the Allies adapted by sending multiple Mitchells to attack groups, coordinating their runs to overwhelm the defenses. Other U-boats tried to cross submerged during the day, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and run the diesels. This reduced their exposure to air attack, but increased the time required to transit the bay, leaving them vulnerable for longer periods. It also exhausted the crews, who had to remain at battle stations for days on end, and drained the batteries to dangerous levels, leaving the submarines with little reserve power for evasion or combat. Some U-boats were fitted with experimental anti-aircraft weapons, heavier guns, and improved mounts. A few boats received the Veerling, a quad mount of 20mm cannons capable of putting out a fearsome volume of fire. These boats had better success fending off attacks, forcing the Mitchells to approach more cautiously, but the modifications took time and resources, and there were never enough of the improved weapons to equip the entire fleet. Meanwhile, the strafer squadrons refined their own tactics. They learned to approach from the sun, blinding the U-boat lookouts until the last moment. They learned to coordinate attacks, one Mitchell drawing fire while another came in from a different angle. They learned to target specific parts of the submarine, aiming for the conning tower to kill the officers and disable command and control, aiming for the deck to destroy the guns, aiming for the waterline to rupture the hull and flood the interior spaces. The pilots developed a sixth sense for reading the surface, for spotting the subtle signs of a submarine. A patch of smooth water in a rough sea, indicating the upwelling from a submerged boat running shallow. A flash of sunlight on a periscope lens, a trace of exhaust smoke from diesel engines. Birds circling over floating debris marking the grave of a recently sunk U-boat. Every
detail mattered. Every observation could mean the difference between a successful hunt and an empty patrol. The nose gunners, the men who controlled the devastating firepower of the 850 calibers, became the kings of the strafer crews. Their skill determined the success or failure of each attack. The best gunners could place their fire with surgical precision, stitching a line of bullets along the submarine's pressure hull, avoiding wasted shots, maximizing damage.
They learned to adjust for the motion of the aircraft, for the distance to target, for the deflection caused by the submarine's movement through the water. They learned to fire in short bursts, conserving ammunition, preventing the guns from overheating. And they learned to kill without hesitation, without mercy. The U-boats they hunted were not abstract targets. They were filled with men, sailors like themselves, doing their duty. But those men were also the enemy, the ones sinking the convoys, drowning the merchant seamen, prolonging the war. The nose gunners did not dwell on the humanity of their targets. They focused on the mission, on the trigger, on the destruction they were ordered to deliver. By August 1943, the statistics were undeniable. U-boat losses in the Bay of Biscay had tripled compared to the previous year. The rate of successful transits was plummeting. Submarines that made it to the Atlantic were arriving damaged, demoralized, their crews exhausted before they even reached the hunting grounds. The effectiveness of the U-boat campaign was collapsing, not because the submarines themselves were inferior, but because they could not reach their targets without running a gauntlet that cost more than the results justified. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had seemed unwinnable for the Allies in early 1943, was turning. The convoys were getting through. The shipping losses were declining. The stranglehold on Britain was loosening. And a significant part of that shift was due to the strafers, to the ungainly B-25 Mitchells with their 8-gun noses hunting submarines in the Bay of Biscay. Yet victory came with a price. The strafer crews paid it in blood and wreckage. Lieutenant James Mackay, pilot of a Mitchell named Savage Siren, led his crew on 43 missions over the bay before his luck ran out. On the 44th mission, attacking a group of 3 U-boats, his aircraft took a direct hit from a 20mm shell that detonated in the cockpit. The Mitchell rolled inverted and plunged into the water at 300 miles per hour, killing Mackay and his entire crew instantly. There was no time for parachutes, no time for anything except the sudden transition from life to death. Staff Sergeant Robert Shen, nose gunner on a Mitchell called Iron Hammer, survived 19 missions before a ricochet from a U-boat's deck plating entered the nose compartment and severed his femoral artery. He bled out before the aircraft could return to base, his last words a request to tell his mother he had done his duty. His pilot, Captain Michael Torres, landed the shot-up Mitchell with Shen's body still in the nose and requested a transfer to a different aircraft. He could not, he said, fly Iron Hammer again. The request was denied. There were not enough planes or pilots to indulge sentiment. Technical Sergeant William O'Hara, flight engineer on a Mitchell called Devil's Advocate, completed 31 missions and earned a reputation as the luckiest man in the squadron. His aircraft took damage on nearly every mission, flak holes and bullet strikes, but always made it home. On the 32nd mission, attacking a U-boat at dawn, a stray bullet from the submarine's dying gunner struck O'Hara in the head as he stood in the waist gun position scanning for threats. He died instantly, and his crewmates, unable to process the randomness of his death, flew the rest of the mission in silence. The losses were not only from enemy action. Low-level flying in all weather over the ocean was inherently dangerous. Mitchells crashed due to mechanical failure, pilot error, bad weather, navigation mistakes. One aircraft flew into a cliff in fog, killing the crew. Another suffered an engine failure on takeoff and crashed into the sea before the crew could bail out. A third collided with another Mitchell during a formation landing attempt, both aircraft exploding on impact. The work of hunting submarines was deadly in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. But the survivors kept flying. They had no choice, and more than that, they had purpose. Every mission briefing reminded them of the stakes. Every intelligence report detailed the convoys saved, the submarines killed, the tonnage delivered. The strafers were making a difference, a measurable, undeniable difference, and that knowledge sustained them through the fear and exhaustion. In the mess halls and barracks, the crews swapped stories. Attacks that went perfectly, the submarine torn apart in seconds, sinking before it could dive. Attacks that went wrong, the Mitchell taking heavy damage, limping home on one engine, crew members wounded or dead. Near misses, where the submarine dove just as the Mitchell opened fire, the bullets churning empty water. Unlikely survivals, where a Mitchell riddled with holes somehow stayed airborne long enough to reach land. They talked about the U-boat crews, too, with a strange mixture of respect and hatred. The German gunners who stayed at their posts, firing until the Mitchell's bullets cut them down. The captains who fought their boats with skill and courage, even knowing they were outmatched. The survivors pulled from the water after their submarine sank, shivering and traumatized, grateful to be alive, but ashamed to have been defeated. The strafer crews did not celebrate the deaths of individual sailors. They celebrated the destruction of submarines, the machines that had killed so many. But they understood that machines were crewed by men, and that those men died badly. The psychological toll was immense. Many strafer crew members suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares of attacks, of aircraft crashing, of men burning and drowning. Hypervigilance, inability to relax, startling at sudden sounds. Survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many others had died. The military of 1943 had no framework for addressing these issues, no mental health support beyond informal peer counseling and alcohol. The crews coped as best they could, and those who could not cope were quietly removed from flight status. By September 1943, the strategic situation in the Atlantic had fundamentally changed. The U-boats were no longer a decisive threat. They still operated, still sank ships, but the balance had shifted. The convoys were winning. The invasion of Europe scheduled for the following year was now feasible because the Allies could guarantee the flow of supplies across the Atlantic. And the Bay of Biscay, that vital choke point, had been closed by the strafers. Dönitz, reading the reports from his submarine commanders, understood that the game was up. The losses were unsustainable, the morale was broken, the tactical situation was hopeless. He petitioned Hitler to withdraw the U-boats from the bay, to base them elsewhere, to find a new strategy. Hitler, detached from reality, refused. The U-boats would continue to operate, the Atlantic campaign would continue, the losses were acceptable in the grand scheme of the war. Dönitz, a realist, knew better. But he was a soldier, and he followed orders. The U-boats continued to cross the bay, and the strafers continued to hunt them. The killing continued through the fall of 1943, through the winter into 1944. By then, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany was losing on every front. The Atlantic was secure. The invasion of Europe, scheduled for the following year, was now feasible because the Allies could guarantee the flow of supplies across the Atlantic, and the Bay of Biscay, that vital choke point, had been closed by the strafers.
Change the course of a campaign. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber never designed for anti-submarine warfare, had become the U-boat's worst nightmare because someone had asked a simple question. What if we put more guns on it? That question and the answer it produced had saved thousands of lives and secured the Atlantic for the Allies. The men who flew the strafers were not celebrated as heroes in the way fighter aces were. Their work was too grim, too utilitarian. They did not duel in the sky or protect bombers on dramatic missions. They hunted submarines, killing them methodically, mission after mission, until the enemy could no longer operate. It was unglamorous work, brutal and necessary, and history has largely forgotten them. But the results spoke for themselves. In the first 4 months of 1943, before the strafers became fully operational, U-boats sank over 100 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. In the last 4 months of 1943, after the strafers had closed the bay, U-boat sinkings dropped to fewer than 30 ships.
The difference was stark, measurable, undeniable. The strafers had broken the back of the U-boat campaign. For the U-boat crews, the memory of the strafers became a nightmare that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Werner Hartmann, who had barely escaped the Mitchell attack on U-517, spent 3 more months in submarines before his boat was depth-charged and sunk by a British destroyer. He survived, was taken prisoner, and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Canada. After the war, he returned to Germany and became a schoolteacher, never speaking publicly about his time in the U-boat service. But his family noted that he never flew on an airplane, never went near the ocean, and woke screaming from nightmares well into his 70s. For the strafer crews, the memory was different. They had done their job, had done it well, and had survived. If they survived. Those who made it through the war carried the weight of what they had done, the knowledge of the men they had killed, but also the certainty that their actions had saved lives, had shortened the war, had mattered. It was a hard trade, but one they made willingly. The last recorded attack by a B-25 strafer on a U-boat in the Bay of Biscay occurred on March 15, 1944. The submarine was U-845, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Werner Johansson, a veteran officer on his 5th patrol. The Mitchell, flown by Captain David Kowalski, caught U-845 on the surface at dawn, engines running, making a high-speed dash for the Atlantic. The attack was textbook perfect. Kowalski brought the Mitchell in low and fast, his nose gunner opening fire at 300 yards, walking the bullets along the submarine's hull. The conning tower was shredded, the deck guns destroyed, the pressure hull breached in multiple places. U-845 sank in less than 2 minutes, taking Johansson and his entire crew to the bottom. Kowalski circled the wreck site, noted the oil and debris, radioed the kill, and turned for home. It was his 27th mission, and he would fly 12 more before the war ended. He survived, returned to the United States, and never spoke about his time in the strafers, except to say that he had done what was asked of him. The Mitchell he flew, named Final Judgment, was scrapped in 1946, cut apart from metal, its history forgotten. But the impact of that aircraft and the hundreds like it lived on. The tactics developed by the strafer squadrons influenced anti-submarine warfare for decades. The idea of using heavy forward-firing armament on patrol aircraft became doctrine. The AC-130 gunship, bristling with cannons and machine guns, traces its lineage directly back to the 8-gun Mitchells of 1943. The concept of turning a bomber into a gunship, of overwhelming the target with firepower instead of precision, became a cornerstone of aerial warfare. The Bay of Biscay returned to being just a body of water after the war. The U-boat pens in Lorient and other French ports were destroyed or repurposed. The airfields in Cornwall and Devon went quiet, then
were closed, then were built over. The men who had fought there on both sides aged and died, taking their memories with them. The ocean, indifferent to human conflict, continued its internal rhythm. But for a brief, terrible period in 1943 and early 1944, the Bay had been a battlefield unlike any other. Submarines hunted by bombers, steel torn apart by bullets, men dying in the pursuit of strategic goals that felt, in the moment, like abstractions. The strafers had turned the tide, had closed the highway, had broken the back of the U-boat threat. They had done it with ungainly aircraft, improvised weapons, and the willingness to fly low and slow into the teeth of enemy fire. The story of the B-25 strafers and their war against the U-boats is a story of innovation born from desperation, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, of tactics that should not have worked, but did. It is a reminder that wars are won not only by grand strategies and superior resources, but by the willingness to try something different, to take risks, to adapt faster than the enemy. Germany never expected B-25 8-gun noses to saw U-boats apart. They expected patrol aircraft, depth charges, destroyers. They did not expect bombers turned into gunships hunting submarines with streams of 50-caliber fire. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. The Bay was lost, the Atlantic was secure, and the war was turning irreversibly against them.
The men who flew the strafers did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as doing a job, a dangerous and necessary job, in a war that had to be won. They flew, they fought, they died or survived, and then they went home. Most of them never spoke about what they had done. Most of them tried to forget. But history remembers even when the participants do not. The B-25 strafers, with their 8-gun noses and their low-level attacks, changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. They turned hunters into prey. They closed a vital choke point. They saved countless lives by taking others. And they did it all with machines that were never meant for the task, flown by men who rose to meet the challenge. The legacy is simple and stark. When the balance of a campaign hangs by a thread, when conventional methods are failing, when the situation demands something new, innovation and courage can tip the scales. The strafers proved it, the U-boats learned it, and the Atlantic, that cold and merciless ocean, became the classroom where the lesson was taught in blood and steel and the roar of engines diving toward the waves.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.